Beneath a parking lot in Lower Manhattan, archaeologists unearthed 419 bodies. Men, women, children. Some wore cowrie shell necklaces, others had coins placed over their eyes. Every one of them had been enslaved. Their bones rested undisturbed under New York City's streets for over 200 years. The world erased their existence. Then construction workers broke ground in 1991 and discovered something that would force America to confront the history it had been teaching for generations. Scientists didn't just recover bodies. They uncovered a story encoded in DNA that challenges everything we believed about where enslaved Africans originated, how they endured, and who their descendants truly are. The findings didn't merely surprise historians. They demolished assumptions that had persisted for 4 centuries. What they exposed about Black American ancestry continues to send shockwaves through genetic research. If you want to grasp how DNA is transforming the entire narrative of Black history in America, you're exactly where you need to be. I examine genetic breakthroughs, ancestry revelations, and historical puzzles that reshape our understanding of the past. Hit subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. We're only beginning. In 1991, the General Services Administration set out to construct a 34-story federal office tower at 290 Broadway in Lower Manhattan. Protocol demanded an archaeological survey before construction began. Nobody anticipated finding anything meaningful. This was downtown Manhattan, one of the most built-up, most excavated, most thoroughly documented parcels of land in America. If something significant existed underground, someone would have located it already. The survey crew began digging test pits on a Tuesday morning in October. Within hours, they struck human remains, then more and more. By week's end, they had exposed evidence of dozens of burials. What began as routine compliance transformed into the most crucial archaeological find in New York City history. They had stumbled upon the African Burial Ground, a 6-acre cemetery where free and enslaved Africans were interred between the 1690s and 1794. At its height, this burial ground contained an estimated 15,000 to 20,000 bodies. It represented the largest and oldest known excavated burial ground in North America for both free and enslaved Africans. The revelation electrified the city. Activists immediately organized, construction ground to a halt. These weren't simply bones, they were ancestors. The fact that New York City had paved over them, constructed on top of them, and wiped them from official records for 2 centuries wasn't something the Black community would accept silently. But here's what makes this find so staggering. New York doesn't portray itself as a slave state. The account you absorbed in school likely framed slavery as a Southern phenomenon, cotton plantations, the Deep South. That's where the narrative unfolds. New York. New York was forward-thinking, industrial, a metropolis of immigrants and possibility. That's the myth. New York in the 1700s reveals something entirely different. By 1730, 42% of New York City households owned enslaved people, nearly half. Manhattan possessed one of the highest concentrations of enslaved Africans outside Charleston, South Carolina. In the early 18th century, New York held the largest enslaved population of any city north of Maryland. These weren't people in transit. They constructed the city. They built Wall Street, literally. The wall that named the street was erected by enslaved laborers in 1653. They cleared terrain, they laid roads, they raised buildings, they labored at the docks, loading and unloading ships that delivered more enslaved people into the colony. They prepared meals in wealthy homes. They raised white children. They performed the grueling work that kept New York City operating. When they died, white New Yorkers refused to let them rest in church cemeteries. In 1697, the Common Council of New York enacted an ordinance prohibiting the burial of Africans in what was then the primary colonial cemetery. The stated justification was sanitation. The actual reason was racism. White residents rejected having Black bodies interred alongside white bodies. Even in death, the enslaved and free Black population was compelled to bury their dead beyond the city boundaries in an area white New Yorkers deemed worthless land. That area became the African Burial Ground, a space where people assembled to grieve, to perform ceremonies, and to preserve traditions that slavery attempted to obliterate. For over a century, this burial ground remained one of the rare spaces where Black New Yorkers exercised any autonomy whatsoever. When they died, white New Yorkers chose to erase the burial ground from existence. After 1794, when the city prohibited all burials below Canal Street, the African Burial Ground closed. The city grew. Buildings rose above the graves. Streets covered the bones. Developers purchased the property and built warehouses, shops, and eventually office complexes. By the mid-1800s, the The burial ground had been completely removed from maps and collective memory. No markers, no monuments, no recognition that thousands of people lay beneath the surface. Just pavement and advancement, and the selective forgetting that permits a city to ignore its own transgressions. For 197 years, thousands of people crossed over these graves daily without awareness of what lay beneath them. Wall Street executives on lunch breaks, tourists photographing old New York, municipal workers heading to the subway, all of them walking on sacred ground that had been intentionally erased from history, until that construction team penetrated the soil in October 1991 and revealed a cemetery that white New York had attempted to bury twice, once underground, once in the historical record. The bones they exposed would compel the city to face a past it had spent 2 centuries attempting to forget. When archaeologists excavated the location, they didn't merely discover bones. They found proof of lives that contradicted the sanitized version of northern slavery. The skeletal remains displayed evidence of severe physical trauma, compression fractures in spines, damaged joints, torn ligaments. These weren't injuries from mishaps. They resulted from carrying impossibly heavy loads year after year. Children as young as 6 exhibited these identical markers. Their bones had been stressed before they completed growing. One woman cataloged as burial 340 died in her early 20s. Her spine revealed severe arthritis. Her vertebrae had compressed under repetitive heavy lifting. By the time she was buried, her body had aged decades beyond her actual years. Another set of remains, burial 101, belonged to a man in his late 30s. His bones disclosed multiple fractures that had healed inadequately. Breaks in his ribs, arms, and legs. Each fracture narrated a story of violence, insufficient medical attention, being compelled back to labor before healing finished. Then there were the children. Burial 260 was an infant, perhaps 8 months old, buried carefully with a strand of glass beads. Someone loved this child enough to send them into the afterlife with a symbol of affection, but the child's bones displayed signs of malnutrition and illness, conditions that could have been avoided if they had access to proper food and medicine. The burial practices themselves disclosed something profound. Many of the deceased were interred with artifacts that pointed directly back to West and Central African traditions. Cowrie shells, once used as currency in regions of Africa, appeared in multiple graves. Some bodies were positioned in manners that aligned with specific ethnic group practices from the African continent. The physical evidence was damning. It was, however, incomplete. The bones could inform scientists what happened to these people. They could expose the brutality, the labor, the suffering, but they couldn't answer the most critical question: where did these people come from? For over a decade following the discovery, the remains sat in storage while debates raged about their fate. Activists demanded respect and proper burial. Scientists sought access for investigation. The federal government, embarrassed by what had been exposed on its construction property, attempted to navigate between competing interests. Eventually, in 1993, Congress designated the location a National Historic Landmark and allocated funding for a comprehensive research initiative. In 2003, the African Burial Ground Project obtained approval to perform DNA analysis on select remains. This was revolutionary for multiple reasons. Ancient DNA extraction remained relatively new technology in the early 2000s. The techniques that are standard now were experimental then. Extracting viable genetic material from bones that had been in wet Manhattan soil for over 200 years was a serious gamble. Contamination, degradation, and incomplete samples were all genuine risks that could render the entire endeavor worthless. But the potential reward was enormous. If scientists could successfully extract and sequence DNA from these remains, they could trace the geographic origins of these individuals back to specific African regions, potentially even specific ethnic groups. This had never been accomplished at this magnitude before for enslaved populations in North America. The research team, directed by biological anthropologists and geneticists from Howard University, concentrated on mitochondrial DNA. This is DNA transmitted from mother to child through the maternal line, and it remains relatively consistent over centuries. Mitochondrial DNA doesn't recombine the way nuclear DNA does, which means it functions like a genetic timestamp. It carries markers that connect individuals to specific populations and migration patterns that can be traced back thousands of years. The team selected teeth and dense bone samples from the femur and skull, which had the strongest chance of preserving genetic material. Each sample underwent an extraction process that was meticulous and exacting. The bones were first cleaned and sterilized to eliminate any surface contamination from contemporary DNA. Then small fragments were ground into powder and treated with chemicals that broke down the bone matrix and released whatever genetic material remained inside. That DNA, degraded and fragmented after 2 centuries underground, had to be amplified using a process called polymerase chain reaction. This technique generates millions of copies of the DNA fragments, so there's sufficient material to analyze. The amplified DNA was then sequenced and compared against reference databases of African populations. Then the results arrived. What they discovered didn't align with the assumptions historians had been operating under for generations. The DNA disclosed that the people buried in this cemetery originated from a far broader range of African regions than anyone had anticipated. The assumption, based on historical shipping records and slave trade manifests, was that most enslaved people transported to New York came from West Africa, specifically from areas that are now Senegal, Gambia, Ghana, and Sierra Leone. Those regions dominated the transatlantic slave trade routes to North America in the 1700s. Ships departed ports in Liverpool and Bristol, sailed to the West African coast, loaded human cargo, then crossed to the Americas. But the DNA revealed a different reality. Yes, some individuals possessed genetic markers linking them to West Africa, but others traced back to Central Africa, particularly the Congo Basin and Angola. Some individuals exhibited genetic markers from southeastern African regions, including what are now Mozambique and Madagascar. Those regions were long believed to have supplied enslaved labor primarily to South America, especially Brazil, and to the Caribbean, not to North America. One individual catalogued as Burial 101 displayed genetic connections to the Bantu-speaking populations of Central Africa. His mitochondrial DNA matched haplogroups common in modern-day Congo and Angola. This indicated that his maternal ancestors originated from deep in the interior of Central Africa, likely captured during the expansion of the Congo Kingdom's participation in the slave trade. Another individual, Burial 340, possessed markers suggesting ancestry from multiple regions. Her mitochondrial DNA revealed a combination that indicated her mother or grandmother likely originated from the Senegambia region. But other genetic signals pointed to Central African connections as well. This kind of mixed ancestry wasn't unusual. It indicated that even before enslavement, her family had been part of migration patterns or trade networks that connected different parts of Africa. The presence of Central and Southeastern African ancestry was a revelation. It demonstrated the transatlantic slave trade to North America was far more complex and far-reaching than the simplified account taught in textbooks. Enslaved Africans weren't just being extracted from a handful of coastal regions that had direct trade relationships with British and Dutch merchants. They were being torn from communities across the entire continent. The DNA results exposed something that shipping manifests and historical records had concealed or deliberately obscured. Many of these individuals likely arrived in New York through the Caribbean. They weren't transported directly from Africa to Manhattan. They were sold in Jamaica, Barbados, or other Caribbean colonies first, then resold and shipped north to New York as part of the intercolonial slave trade. This means these people survived the Middle Passage, the horrific transatlantic voyage that killed an estimated 15 to 20% of all enslaved Africans forced onto ships. They survived that, then they survived the brutal Caribbean plantation system, which maintained one of the highest mortality rates in the entire slave trade. Sugar plantations in the Caribbean worked enslaved people to death within 7 years on average. After surviving that hell, these individuals were uprooted again, separated from whatever community they had managed to construct and forced into labor in colonial New York. Multiple layers of trauma, multiple displacements, multiple erasures of identity and family. Their DNA carried the account of a journey that official records never fully documented, because enslavers didn't care where their human property originated, as long as they could work. The DNA findings compelled historians to confront uncomfortable truths about how the story of slavery in America had been narrated. For generations, textbooks treated the North and South as fundamentally different. The South had slavery, the North had industry and moral clarity. That was the narrative. The African burial ground shattered that myth. The DNA analysis provided a layer of evidence that couldn't be dismissed or reinterpreted. These weren't just anonymous bones. They were individuals with traceable ancestry, and their presence in New York demonstrated that Northern complicity in slavery was deeper and more extensive than most Americans had been taught. But the genetic revelations didn't stop at regional origins. Scientists also analyzed the DNA to understand family structures and kinship networks among the enslaved population in New York. What they discovered was heartbreaking and revealing. Mitochondrial DNA analysis demonstrated that several individuals buried near each other shared maternal lineage. They were related. Mothers buried near children, siblings laid to rest side by side. This meant that despite the constant threat of family separation through sale, some enslaved families in New York managed to remain together, at least in death. The analysis also exposed a darker reality. Many individuals showed no genetic connection to others in the burial ground. They died alone, separated from everyone they had known. No family, no community, just isolation, even in the grave. The DNA also offered clues about survival and adaptation. Genetic markers revealed that these populations had high levels of genetic diversity, which suggests that the enslaved community in New York was constantly being replenished with people from different regions and backgrounds. There was no single homogeneous African population. These were people from dozens of distinct ethnic groups, languages, and cultural traditions, forced into a new collective identity by the brutality of enslavement. And here's what this means for Black Americans today. The African burial ground DNA analysis was one of the first large-scale efforts to trace African ancestry in North America using genetic evidence. The findings established the groundwork for the entire African ancestry DNA testing industry that exists now. Companies like 23andMe and Ancestry DNA use reference populations and markers similar to those established by the African burial ground research. When a Black American takes a DNA test today and discovers they have ancestry from Nigeria, Ghana, Cameroon, or Congo, they're benefiting from the baseline data that projects like this created. But the research also revealed just how complicated African ancestry is for Black Americans. Slavery didn't just displace people geographically, it erased specific ethnic identities. The DNA might display markers from the Yoruba, the Igbo, or the Bakongo, but the cultural knowledge, languages, and traditions that accompanied those identities were systematically destroyed. So when someone discovers through DNA testing that they have ancestry from a specific region, they're uncovering a connection that slavery attempted to sever. But the complete picture of who their ancestors were, what languages they spoke, what gods they worshipped, what songs they sang, that's mostly gone. The DNA provides them a map, but the territory itself has been erased. In 2003, the remains from the African burial ground were reinterred in a ceremony that attracted thousands. Descendants of enslaved New Yorkers, African diplomats, historians, activists, and city officials gathered at the site to honor the dead and acknowledge the history that had been hidden for 2 centuries. It was October 4th, and the ceremony included traditional African rituals, prayers from multiple faiths, and speeches that didn't shy away from condemning the city's complicity in slavery and erasure. But the DNA research didn't end with the reburial. Scientists continued to analyze the samples, and as genetic sequencing technology improved over the next decade, they could extract more information from smaller and more degraded samples. What had been impossible in 2003 became routine by 2010. One of the most significant developments occurred when researchers began comparing the African burial ground DNA with modern African populations and African diaspora communities across the United States, the Caribbean, and South America. They wanted to determine if they could trace descendants. Could someone alive today be a direct genetic match to someone buried in that Manhattan cemetery over 200 years ago? The odds were incredibly long. Genetic drift, intermarriage, migration across continents, all of these factors dilute specific ancestral markers over generations. After 8 or 9 generations, the genetic signature from a single ancestor becomes a tiny fraction of a person's total DNA. But the researchers found something nonetheless. Several living Black Americans tested positive for genetic markers that closely matched individuals from the burial ground. These weren't definitive parent-child connections. The time gap was too large for that. But the mitochondrial DNA haplogroups matched closely enough to suggest shared maternal ancestry within the last 10 to 15 generations. One woman from Brooklyn, a retired schoolteacher named Lorraine, participated in the descendant study in 2011. Her mitochondrial DNA matched the haplogroup of a young woman buried in the African burial ground, cataloged as Burial 25. The woman in the grave had died in her early 20s, likely from complications during childbirth based on the skeletal analysis. She had been buried with care. Someone had placed a ring on her finger, a small act of love in a system designed to strip away humanity. For Lorraine, the match was overwhelming. She had always known her ancestors were enslaved, but the details stopped abruptly around the early 1800s. Church records, census data, birth certificates, none of it existed for enslaved people. Her family tree hit a wall, but this DNA match gave her something she never thought she would have: a connection to a specific person, a young woman who lived, who loved, who was loved enough that someone gave her a ring to wear into eternity. Lorraine started researching burial practices in West Africa, attempting to understand the cultural traditions that might have influenced how this woman was laid to rest. She visited the African Burial Ground Memorial multiple times, standing at the spot where Burial 25 had been excavated, knowing that this young woman's DNA lived on in her. The discovery carried profound emotional weight for her, and for dozens of other descendants who participated in the study. For many Black Americans, slavery severed the connection to specific ancestors. You might know your family tree back 3 or 4 generations if you're fortunate. But beyond that, the records vanish. Enslavers didn't keep detailed genealogies for the people they enslaved. Families were separated through sale, names were changed when people were sold to new enslavers. Bloodlines were deliberately erased from official history because it was easier to justify enslaving people if you could pretend they had no history, no family, no identity. But DNA doesn't forget. It carries the story forward even when the paperwork doesn't exist. For descendants who participated in the genetic matching studies, it was a moment of reconnection. Not just to an abstract history, but to actual people. Individuals who lived, suffered, resisted, and survived long enough to pass their DNA down through the generations. But the research also revealed painful truths that many descendants had to grapple with. Some learned that their ancestors had been subjected to sexual violence. Genetic analysis showed that several individuals buried in the African burial ground had European ancestry markers mixed into their DNA. Not from consensual relationships. In the context of slavery, there was no such thing as consent. These markers were evidence of rape, of enslavers and overseers forcing themselves on enslaved women and girls. That reality has carried forward into the DNA of Black Americans today. Studies estimate that the average African American has approximately 24% European ancestry. That number didn't come from immigration or intermarriage in the modern sense. It came from systemic sexual violence that spanned the entire period of slavery and continued well into the Jim Crow era. Generations of white men raping Black women and girls produced children who carried that genetic legacy forward. The African burial ground DNA made that truth undeniable. It wasn't a theory or an assumption based on anecdotal evidence. It was written into the bones. One individual, Burial 15, a woman who died in her 30s, had genetic markers indicating that her father or grandfather was likely of European descent. She had been buried with her infant child beside her. The child showed the same mixed ancestry, a family tree rooted in violence. For descendants processing these findings, there was no easy way to reconcile the information. Pride in surviving, anger at the violence, grief for ancestors who suffered in ways that are almost unimaginable. All of it tangled together. But the DNA gave them the truth, and the truth, however painful, is better than the silence and erasure that came before. The African burial ground is now a national monument. The site at 290 Broadway has a memorial and a museum. Visitors can stand on the same ground where those 419 individuals were uncovered and learn the history that New York tried to erase. But the legacy of the DNA research extends far beyond that one site. It set a precedent for how genetic analysis can be used to reclaim erased histories. Since the African Burial Ground Project, similar efforts have been launched at other historical sites across the United States. In 2022, researchers used DNA extracted from remains at a colonial-era plantation in Maryland to trace ancestry back to specific regions in Africa. In Virginia, genetic studies of enslaved populations have revealed migration patterns and family networks that official records never documented. Each new project adds another piece to the puzzle. Collectively, they're building a counter-narrative to the history that was written by enslavers and their descendants. A history that minimized the scale of slavery in the North, erased the ethnic diversity of enslaved Africans, and ignored the ongoing genetic legacy of sexual violence. But the ethical questions are difficult. Who has the right to study these remains? Who benefits from the knowledge? What happens when genetic findings reveal things that descendants might not want to know? Some descendants of enslaved people have argued that DNA research on burial grounds is a form of continued violation. These people didn't consent to being studied. They were already stripped of autonomy in life. Now their bodies are being analyzed in death. Others argue that the research is essential, that it's one of the only ways to recover a history that was deliberately destroyed, that without DNA evidence, the true scope and horror of slavery will continue to be downplayed and forgotten. There's no easy answer. But what's clear is that the DNA inside those bones has already rewritten Black history in ways that cannot be undone. It's proven that the transatlantic slave trade was more far-reaching than previously understood. It's shown that Northern complicity in slavery was deeper and more extensive than textbooks acknowledged. And it's given descendants a genetic link to ancestors they never thought they would be able to trace. The bones don't lie, and the DNA doesn't forget. What scientists found in the African burial ground isn't just about the past. It's about who gets to tell the story, who gets to be remembered, and how the truth buried beneath the pavement eventually forces its way back to the surface. The federal office building at 290 Broadway was eventually completed. It now houses government offices and agencies. But underneath, beneath layers of concrete and steel, the memory of 15,000 to 20,000 people remains. Most of them will never be excavated. Their names will never be known, but their presence is undeniable. And thanks to the DNA extracted from just a fraction of those remains, the story of who they were and where they came from is no longer a mystery. It's a truth that America cannot bury again.